Cyberpunk isn't the game a lot of people thought it would be. It's not GTA in the future, it's not the most in-depth sandbox ever made, and it's certainly not the next generation of RPGs. Baldur's Gate 3 took that title. But what Cyberpunk is one of the most deep, meaningful, and everlasting experiences I've ever had in a game. Before we can dive into that though, we need to take a look back on why this special game had so much controversy, and the story of a product that for so long was rejected, when all along it was home to something so powerful. You see, back in 2020 when Cyberpunk first released, it was met with some of the most hate I've ever seen for a video game. I distinctly remember waking up every weekend to play what I thought was such a fun and engaging game, but every time I looked online, it seemed like I was the only one who thought so. Thousands of people in every form across the internet gathered around to tear this game to shreds, and because of it, my faith in it too began to wane. I started to notice more of the bugs, the lack of deep RPG features, and cars that would spawn in the sky only to drop down and explode into a crowd where the police system was basically non-existent. But then, every time I started to lose hope, I would go on another quest, meet another character, and most importantly, experience another moment that proved to me that this game was so much more than the sum of its parts. And while nowadays this game has finally been fixed in the eyes of many people, I don't see it that way. I see it as a game that has always had so many issues, but even then, the core of what makes art beautiful, meaningful, and memorable has always been intrinsic to its mantra. If you go back and actually watch that 40-minute demo of the game from years ago, or read all the press releases and updates from the time, something you'll notice is that a lot of the hype and expectations were becoming unrealistic not because of CD Projekt Red themselves, but the community too. One of my favorite examples of this is Reddit posts talking about features in the game that never existed. Hundreds of upvotes on posts about mechanics that weren't even in the game, yet everyone gathered around and talked about them as if they were, even when they had never been spoken about. Don't believe me? Well, here's a perfect example. There was an interview in a GameStar article months before the game's release with some of the developers, and in the audio section, someone on Reddit who apparently spoke German translated a lot of the discussion into text format on Reddit. This included claims that there were thousands of unique NPCs with daily routines, a police system that would put GTA to shame, and flying cars. So the community latched onto this post, and after thousands of upvotes, everyone was excited about what they were hearing. But here's the thing, that translation was all wrong. The developers never said there were unique routines for all the wholly unique NPCs. They never claimed the police were the greatest of all time with max tac always touching down, or that cars had garages and could fly in this article, for example. Nonetheless though, soon these claims were being picked up by bigger publications. You can go back and look up these articles even referencing the Reddit post or the GameStar article itself, all making completely false and made up claims about a game that wasn't even out yet. And here's the best part. Developers themselves from CD Projekt Red came into these forums and commented, letting people know that the claims were not true, but they were downvoted, screamed at, and ignored. And for months after this, even beyond this one example, so many lies and unrealistic expectations were spread everywhere. But that doesn't mean the creators of Cyberpunk had no fault here. They did make claims that were overzealous. They did lie, and most of all, committed scummy acts like hiding last-gen console performance until release and basically scamming their customers. They should have been more diligent in letting people know in official press releases about all the lies, but instead they leaned into it. And most of all, they showed poor character and leadership when they needed it most. We shouldn't look back and forgive all that happened, but we should remember that the story isn't as black and white as you've been told. I played this game on everything day one, and I loved it even then. And there are lots of people like me too. So don't just believe it was horrible because you never played and everything you heard told you so. And there's so many things too people complain about nowadays that don't actually matter. That cutscene with Jackie was never meant to be a fully playable first act, and I think the game is better that way. It wouldn't fit the story it was trying to tell. It would just add a bunch of needless padding. The complete lack of choice and consequence was overblown, as there's many points in the game like saving Takamura where it's never explained that you can do something, but if you give it a shot, it can drastically change the story. The life paths being so short short, in my opinion, is fine. It gives the teams more time to focus on what most players will actually see anyways, and each of them set the scene in their own way regardless of it being short, and they have a lot of interesting dialogue options throughout the game. Or what about that hacking minigame or wall climbing that we saw in the original 40-minute demo? To this day, so many people complain that we never got that game and instead got something worse. But did you know that wall running was taken out so they could focus more on making the environments more interesting, with buildings with lots of structures sticking out that would make wall running impossible? If you look at the demo from years ago that got people so hyped, many of the buildings in the background of the game have so much more life and design nowadays than when they were first presented. Just look at this scene, for example. And if you go back and watch the hacking minigame again, it looks cool the first time, but imagine having to do this every time you try to engage in combat with hacking. That would get old and boring super fast. And what we got instead is very intuitive, fast-paced, and most importantly, a fun implementation that works so much better as an actual game, not just a cool tech demo. I'd argue that even what we got at launch was much better than the demo we originally were presented, and nowadays, after more updates, it's undeniably so. And that's because instead, we got characters and stories that would live with us forever, and lessons that prove the game was never about being Grand Theft Auto in the future, but rather a narrative that would propel itself into our hearts. But for most people, they have only recently realized this, and that's because after 3 years of patches, the game is finally in the state most always wanted it to be. Ever since the release of patch 1.6 and Edgerunners, and now especially with Phantom Liberty and the 2.1 update, the game finally has dusted off its shoulders and been allowed to shine like it always deserved. Nowadays, when I go online and look at the Cyberpunk forums and Reddit posts, it's amazing just how positive and celebrated this game is now. How much love there is for the story, its characters, and even outside property like the Edgerunners anime. Before, spin-off places like Low Sodium Cyberpunk had to be made for the select few people that enjoyed the game to even talk about it without endless hate. But nowadays, internet forums like this seem completely pointless, as the love for the game is so grand, it's almost hard to find hate from non-trolls anymore. So even though it took many years and a diligence to ignore the backlash knowing they had something great on their hands, CDPR have finally slowly crawled their way back into the good graces of most gamers. Now there are activities like real police chases and even max tac, a fully rehauled skill tree that makes the combat much more streamlined, and countless quality of life features that just make the moment-to-moment gameplay much more enjoyable than before. And in my opinion, it's the most beautiful comeback in the history of games. So what do I want to see in the future of this series then? We already know that CDPR will be releasing a sequel to Cyberpunk codenamed Orion, and that it will be made on Unreal Engine 5 this time. And to be honest, it does have me a little worried. After 3 years of working on the Red Engine and updates, I can say for me at least, with full path tracing and DLSS 3.5, Cyberpunk 2077 is without a doubt the best looking game I've ever played. And as I said, it's the only game in my life where I've never fast traveled. And that's because the city and atmosphere on offer here is just so impressive and awe-inspiring. And the concern I have is that now moving over to a brand new engine, CDPR is taking a huge risk on this sequel. Yes, this means it'll be easier to acquire new talent and also hopefully less of a hassle dealing with an engine that gave them trouble before, but on the same token, I'm just a little apprehensive about Unreal Engine 5 being able to load such an impressive world so seamlessly with such great performance at the same time, even with technologies like Lumen and Nanite. And not only that, but CDPR in the last couple of years have changed a lot, and now instead of the entire studio focusing on one game at a time, there are multiple teams, with the Cyberpunk one opening a new office in Boston in the United States. And while this is awesome and hopefully means more games coming more quickly, it also means building up a brand new set of teams in a whole new location. If anyone can pull it off though, it's this team. And considering how good Phantom Liberty was and just how passionate the leadership team for the Cyberpunk IP going into the future is now, I have a feeling it'll all turn out okay. In terms of what I actually want to see in the sequel itself though, first and foremost, I hope for more of the same. There's a reason Cyberpunk 2077 is my favorite game of all time, and it's because no other game really hits the high moments here quite like it. And more than anything else Cyberpunk Orion could do, it needs to remember what made Cyberpunk so great in the first place. A focus on characters and stories that make us cry, make us think, and give us moments that last in our hearts and souls forever. The sequel needs characters that can hit just as hard as the main cast in the original, and if anything, this will be the hardest part, because in many ways, they did it so perfectly the first time around, and it's going to be hard to capture that same magic again without a lot of talent and work. Next up, quest and mission design along with environments should take a page out of Phantom Liberty's book. Focus on making each quest and side objective meaningful and in-depth with actually impactful decisions and choices that have us sitting in front of our computers wondering what to do for hours. One of the best parts of Phantom Liberty is how each gig sends you to a brand new location with so much verticality and history all its own in these crazy situations. It makes it exciting when you know no matter what you do, you're going to find a new place to explore and learn about this world. In terms of combat, just do more of the same. The focus on making you feel cool no matter what you do is everything Cyberpunk's about. And for the sequel, I think just adding even more options, more cyberware, and even tougher and smarter enemies that really test us would be the best solution. But what about the location? Where should Cyberpunk 2 take place? Well, in my opinion, I think Night City should be the main hub once again. There really just isn't any other location in fantasy out there quite like it. And I think if it was focused purely on next-gen systems only, it could provide the perfect breeding ground for an amazing world. Being able to come back to Night City, but this time with gangs with their own quest lines and more dynamic open-world encounters would be a welcomed improvement to the city and would make it feel more alive. And it also would mean the team could reuse a lot of assets and locations and instead focus on making each of them feel more alive and in-depth with lots of quests at the quality level of Phantom Liberty. Having said that though, I would love to get to see some other locations in this universe too. One thing Cyberpunk lore does so well is it makes it feel like Night City isn't the only place out there. We constantly hear about things happening in Europe, Asia, Brazil, or how nukes fell in Dubai, and being able to visit some of these places even briefly would be amazing in the main story of the sequel. If I had to come up with what I think would be the perfect setup for the Cyberpunk sequel, here's what it would be. Playing as a new character some amount of years into the future, we get involved in a massive espionage mission for a big corporation, either Arasaka, Biotechnica, or Militech. And during this operation, we learn that another corpo war is about to break out, and even more concerning, that many of the AIs behind the Black Wall are finally starting to find their way into the real world now that technological advancements have made their way far enough that these advanced AIs are able to break through. So suddenly, it sets the stage for a massive set of world-changing events where we'll have to choose sides between massive corporations and everyday people, as well as AIs that try to convince us whether or not they have humanity too. This would give us a chance to dive more into the lore of the Black Wall and the AIs to see how Mr. Blue Hands ties into it all, as well as learning more about each of the big corporations we missed out on in the original game. It's the perfect setup from not only a lore and world building point of view, but also simply from just an awesome story arc vantage point. On top of this, advancements in relic technology from Arasaka could mean that we're able to transfer our consciousness into husks in new locations instantly, rather than having to overwrite the minds of helpless individuals like before, meaning we could go in as an undercover agent or mercenary on missions in Japan, Switzerland, Brazil, or even in the space station at the Crystal Palace. So the crux of the game would take place in Night City just like before, meaning not many new assets would have to be created, and instead there would be a focus on just adding more and higher quality quests to keep the world feeling alive. But in the main and some side missions, we could use this technology to travel to smaller and more linear parts of other cities and locations, where we could get a glimpse of the cultures and histories around the world. And then, in the final mission of the game, we could use that same tech to travel to the Crystal Palace and finally get to see the zone that was likely originally planned as a DLC to Cyberpunk 2077. This would be the perfect setup for the sequel because not only is it ripe for so many awesome questions about what it means to be human or a computer, corporations versus the everyday man, along with the usual cyberpunk set dressing, but also it would allow us to explore even more of this amazing world that so many of us have come to love, with stakes even higher than the original that could lead to some of the truly most badass moments in the entire series. The possibilities with this setup are endless, and the team could really take it in any direction. So while I'm sure my exact guesses won't come true, I hope that the ideas for the sequel are at least somewhat along these lines, because I think it's the best way to make a new Cyberpunk worthy of its predecessor. Overall, it's crazy to see that after so many years of begging people to give this game a shot and screaming into the void about how good it really is, that people have finally come around. Cyberpunk 2077 is finally the game people always dreamed of, and the future for this series is brighter than ever with one of the best teams in the business at the helm. And it goes to show that when you make real art that has something to it, art that can move people, no matter how much hate or negativity there is, if you can fix the things that hold it back, one day it will shine. I was always told growing up that sometimes the good guy loses and the bad guy wins. That sometimes a product or piece of art, despite its greatness, is never fully appreciated. But the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that real art, real passion, and greatness has a funny way of always finding its way to the top. Sometimes it can take years, sometimes millennia, and sometimes the creators will never get to see that day. But when a product like Cyberpunk 2077 is made, one that beneath all the bugs and controversy was home to something so meaningful, the universe has an almost magical way of making sure people eventually find out.